This is impossible.
The DNA shows this isn't just an own ape species.
I need to tell you something that will sound impossible, something that defies everything we think we know about the world, about nature, about the dark spaces between civilization and wilderness. My name is Dr. Elena Marsh. I'm 47 years old, a forensic anthropologist who spent 23 years working with the FBI's child abduction rapid deployment teams. I've seen things that would break most people. I've held the bones of children in my hands and promised their families I would find answers. But nothing in all those years of searching through forests and abandoned buildings, nothing in all those case files and late-night briefings could have prepared me for what I discovered in the summer of 2023, because the answers I found didn't come from evidence boards or witness statements or satellite imagery. They came from a creature that science says doesn't exist. They came from Bigfoot.
And what he showed me about where the missing children are, what he revealed about the truth hiding in our forests, is something that will change everything you believe about the world we live in. It started with a case that wouldn't let me go. 7 children had vanished over 18 months from a rural corridor stretching through the Cascade Mountains of Washington state. 7 kids, ages 6 to 14, gone without a trace. No bodies, no witnesses, no evidence except for the unbearable silence they left behind. The FBI classified it as a probable serial abduction, likely a single perpetrator who knew the terrain intimately. But there was something about the pattern that felt wrong to me, something that didn't fit the typical profile of human predation. The disappearances happened in locations too remote, too scattered, too impossibly difficult for a single person to navigate. The search grids covered hundreds of square miles of some of the densest forest in North America. Cadaver dogs found nothing. Infrared flyovers revealed nothing. It was as if these children had simply stepped out of reality itself. I remember standing in the incident command center on a cold October morning, staring at the map covered in red pins, each one representing a point of disappearance. My colleague, Special Agent Marcus Webb, stood beside me, his face drawn with the exhaustion we all felt. We'd been searching for 6 months at that point, following every lead, interviewing every resident within 50 miles of the vanishing points. Nothing made sense. The terrain was too rough, the distances too great, the lack of physical evidence too complete. Marcus said something I'll never forget. He looked at that map and said, "It's like something is taking them into the earth itself." At the time, I thought it was just fatigue talking, the kind of desperate metaphor we all resort to when the evidence refuses to tell a coherent story. I had no idea how literally true his words would turn out to be. The break came in March of 2023, though I didn't recognize it as a break at the time. A wilderness guide named Thomas Kern contacted our tip line, claiming he'd seen something unusual near one of the disappearance sites. Thomas was 71, a retired park ranger who'd spent 50 years in these mountains. He wasn't the kind of man given to fantasy or exaggeration. When I met him at a coffee shop in the small town of Concrete, Washington, he looked nervous, choosing his words carefully as if afraid I'd dismiss him immediately. "Dr. Marsh," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, "I've seen something out there, something watching. I know how this sounds, but I've spent half a century in those woods, and I know the difference between a bear and a man and something else entirely." I should have dismissed him. God knows I'd heard enough dubious sightings and conspiracy theories over the years, but there was something in Thomas's eyes, a kind of shaken certainty that made me listen. He described seeing a massive figure moving through the forest near Cascade Pass, something that walked on 2 legs but was far too large to be human, easily 8 feet tall, with shoulders broader than any person he'd ever seen. He'd observed it from a distance through binoculars, watching as it moved with impossible silence through terrain that should have been impassable. And then he told me the detail that made my blood run cold. He said the creature was carrying something wrapped in what looked like cloth or hide, cradled carefully against its chest. The way it moved, he said, was protective, almost tender, like a parent carrying a sleeping child. I went to the site Thomas described.
officially logging it as a follow-up to a witness report, unofficially wondering if I'd finally cracked under the pressure of too many unsolved cases. The hike took me 6 hours into terrain so remote that cell service disappeared within the first mile. The forest there is old, the kind of ancient that makes you feel like an intruder, like you're walking through a cathedral older than human memory. Douglas firs rose hundreds of feet overhead, their canopy so dense that even midday felt like twilight. The air smelled of moss and decomposition and something else, something wild and musky that I couldn't identify. I followed Thomas's directions to a ridge overlooking a small valley, a place where the mountains folded in on themselves, creating a natural amphitheater of stone and timber. And that's where I found the first sign: footprints. But not human footprints. These were enormous, easily 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, pressed deep into the soft earth beside a creek. I knelt down, my training taking over, documenting everything with my camera, taking measurements, making notes. The depth of the impressions suggested something weighing 600 to 700 pounds. The stride length was over 6 feet, but it was the structure of the prints that made me stop breathing for a moment. 5 toes, clearly defined, a broad, flat foot with an arch that looked disturbingly human-like. No claw marks, no signs of the padding you'd see in bear tracks. These were the footprints of something bipedal, something massive, something that shouldn't exist. I spent 3 hours in that valley, finding more prints, finding places where something large had disturbed the vegetation, finding what looked like a deliberately cleared area near a rock overhang. And then, as the afternoon light began to fail and I prepared to make the long hike back to my vehicle, I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand up. It started low, a resonant vocalization that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves. Not quite a howl, not quite a roar, something in between that carried both power and what I can only describe as intention. It was a sound designed to communicate, to warn, to establish presence. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray on my belt, my eyes scanning the darkening forest. And then I saw him. He stood at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by shadow and the massive trunks of old cedars. Even in the failing light, his size was staggering. He had to be 8.5 feet tall, maybe more, with shoulders that would make a professional linebacker look small. His body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair that seemed to absorb what little light remained. But it was his face that held me paralyzed. It was almost human. Heavy brow ridge, broad nose, a jaw that protruded slightly, but not like an ape's, more like an ancient human ancestor's face. And his eyes, God, his eyes, they were dark, deeply intelligent, and they were looking directly at me with an expression I can only describe as evaluation. He was deciding something about me, whether I was a threat, whether I could be trusted, whether I would understand. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Every instinct I had screamed contradictory commands. Run, stay still, reach for my weapon, show I wasn't a threat. My scientific training battled with primal fear and something else, something deeper, wonder. Because I was looking at something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. And in that moment, standing in that darkening forest with a creature from myth staring at me with undeniable intelligence, I made a choice that would change my life forever. I slowly, deliberately took my hand away from the bear spray. I held up both hands, palms out, in what I hoped was a universal gesture of non-aggression, and I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper, cracking with emotion I couldn't name. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm looking for children, missing children. I need to know if you've seen them. His reaction was immediate and shocking. His posture changed, becoming less defensive, more attentive. He tilted his head, studying me with even greater intensity, and then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. He made a gesture, a deliberate movement with one massive hand, pointing at himself, then at me, then deeper into the forest behind him. The message was unmistakable. Follow me. He wanted me to follow him. My training, my common sense, everything rational in me said this was insane, that I should mark this location and return with a full team, with backup, with weapons and documentation equipment. But another part of me, the part that had spent 23 years searching for lost children, the part that had made promises to grieving parents, that part understood that this moment would never come again. If I left now, I would never find him again. He would disappear back into the forest, and whatever answers he might have would disappear with him. So I followed him. God help me. I followed a Bigfoot deeper into the wilderness as night fell over the Cascade Mountains. He moved with surprising care, checking back frequently to make sure I could keep up, adjusting his pace to match my slower human gait. We traveled for over an hour, moving through terrain that grew increasingly difficult, climbing over fallen trees, crossing streams, navigating steep slopes that left me gasping for breath. He never made a sound, his movements almost ghostly for something so massive. I struggled to keep up, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I didn't dare fall behind, because I understood, with a clarity that defied logic, that he was taking me somewhere important, that he was answering my question about the missing children. We reached a place I would never have found on my own, a hidden valley so remote and protected by surrounding ridges that it formed a natural sanctuary invisible from any trail or road. As we descended into the valley, I began to see structures, primitive but deliberate shelters made from branches and bark and moss, arranged in a loose cluster near a clear stream. And then I saw movement, figures emerging from the twilight. More of them. I counted 7 adults, ranging from 7 to 9 feet tall, their bodies covered in hair that varied from dark brown to auburn to almost black. But it wasn't the adults that made me stop in my tracks, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. It was the children, human children, 5 of them, ages that looked to range from about 7 to 13, sitting near one of the shelters, wrapped in what looked like woven plant fiber blankets. They were alive, they were clean, they were calm, and they were being guarded by a female Bigfoot who stood protectively nearby, her eyes watching me with the same evaluation I'd seen in my guide's gaze. I felt my knees go weak, felt tears blur my vision. These children, at least 5 of the 7 who had vanished, were here, alive, safe, but with creatures that science said didn't exist, in a hidden valley that no search team had ever found. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to reconcile the evidence of my eyes with everything I'd been trained to believe. The creature who had led me here made a series of soft vocalizations to the others. I could hear the complexity in the sounds, the variation in tone and rhythm that suggested language, actual structured communication. The female near the children responded, her sounds carrying what I interpreted as concern or question. They were discussing me, deciding what to do about the human who had found their sanctuary. My guide approached the children slowly, making soothing sounds, and one of the older kids, a boy who looked about 12, stood up. He looked at me with eyes that held no fear, only a kind of sad understanding. And then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse, but unmistakably human. "They saved us," he said. "The monsters in the woods aren't them. The monsters are us." I spent that first night in the valley unable to sleep, sitting near a small fire the creatures had built, trying to understand what I was witnessing. The boy who had spoken, his name was Michael Chen, had been missing for 11 months. As dawn broke over the hidden valley, he told me his story in halting sentences, his words coming slowly as if he'd half forgotten how to speak to another human. He'd been hiking with his family near Deception Pass when he'd wandered off the trail, chasing what he thought was a dog. He'd gotten lost, panic setting in as the forest grew dark and unfamiliar. That's when he'd encountered men, human men, who had grabbed him, covering his mouth before he could scream. They dragged him to a vehicle hidden on an old logging road, thrown him inside with 2 other children already unconscious. He'd been taken to a building somewhere deep in the forest, a place that smelled like fear and suffering, where other children were kept in cages, where terrible things happened that he couldn't speak about without his voice breaking completely. But he'd escaped. 3 children had managed to break free during a moment when their captors were distracted, running into the forest in the middle of the night, running until their feet bled and their lungs burned, and they were so lost they couldn't tell which direction they'd come from. They'd expected to die in those woods, expected to freeze or starve or be found by the men who'd taken them. Instead, they'd been found by the forest people. That's what Michael called them, the forest people. He said they'd appeared like ghosts in the darkness, massive shadows that he'd thought at first were bears. But then one of them had knelt down, had made soft sounds, had gently touched his shoulder with a hand that could have crushed him, but instead offered only comfort. They'd carried the 3 escaped children through the night to this valley, had given them water and food, had kept them warm and safe and hidden. Over the following weeks, the forest people had found 2 more children who had also escaped from the same facility, guided by some intelligence network that Michael couldn't fully explain. The creatures seemed to know where to search, seemed to understand that children were being taken and held, seemed to have made it their purpose to find and protect them. They'd brought the rescued children here, to this hidden sanctuary, keeping them safe from the humans who had taken them. But they hadn't returned the children to civilization. Michael explained why, his young face holding an understanding that no child should have to bear. The forest people had tried once, in the beginning, to lead a rescued child back toward the human world, but they'd encountered the traffickers' patrols, armed men searching the forest, and they'd watched from hiding as those men recaptured the child. They'd seen what happened next. They'd heard the screams. After that, the forest people had made a different choice. They would keep the children here, in this hidden valley, protecting them from the monsters who wore human faces. They would keep them alive and safe until it was truly safe to return them. But that safety never came. The men who ran the trafficking operation were too well organized, too well connected, their surveillance of the forest too thorough. And so the children remained, caught between the horror they'd escaped and the world they couldn't safely return to, guarded by creatures who showed them more compassion than many humans ever had. Michael looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you going to take us back? Because if you do, they'll find us again. They have people everywhere, police, rangers, people who are supposed to protect kids but don't. The forest people know this. That's why they keep us hidden. I spent 3 days in that valley, documenting everything, recording statements from the children, trying to understand the full scope of what I'd discovered. The forest people, there were 23 of them living in this extended family group, watched me constantly, but allowed me to move freely among the children. They showed me things, communicated through gestures and expressions, and the complex vocalizations that I slowly began to recognize as genuine language. My guide, the male who had first led me here, seemed to take particular interest in making sure I understood. His name, as best as I could interpret from the sounds the others made when referring to him, was something like a low rumbling followed by a clicking sound. I began thinking of him as Elder because there was wisdom in his eyes, a patient intelligence that suggested long experience. Elder showed me the valley's defenses, the carefully maintained trails that allowed the forest people to move quickly through terrain that would slow or stop humans. The observation points where watchers kept constant surveillance of the approaches to the valley. The cave systems that served as emergency shelters if the group needed to evacuate quickly. This wasn't random wilderness living. This was a sophisticated society with culture, strategy, and purpose. They knew humans were dangerous. They'd known it for so long that caution was bred into their very bones, passed down through generations as survival wisdom. Hide, watch, stay silent, protect your own. And now, protect the human children who had been failed by their own kind. But Elder showed me something else too, something that made the full horror of the situation crystallize with awful clarity. On my second day in the valley, he led me away from the main camp, just the two of us, hiking for an hour to a ridge that overlooked a different part of the forest. He pointed, his massive arm extended towards something in the distance. At first, I couldn't see what he was indicating. Then I noticed it, a break in the canopy, structures that were too regular to be natural, buildings. Hidden beneath camouflage netting and overgrowth, but unmistakably human construction. Elder made a series of sounds, his tone heavy with what I interpreted as warning or anger. Then he drew in the dirt with a stick, his movements surprisingly delicate for his size. He drew simple figures, small ones representing children, larger ones with what looked like weapons. He showed me what he'd witnessed, children being brought to that facility, children who screamed and cried, children who never left. My training recognized what I was looking at, a trafficking hub. A processing facility for kidnapped children, hidden so deep in the wilderness that no conventional investigation would ever find it. The perfect nightmare, a place where the most vulnerable could be taken and held and exploited, protected not just by remoteness, but by the very people who were supposed to serve justice. Because Michael was right. For an operation like this to function, it required corruption at every level. Law enforcement who looked the other way or actively participated. Officials who buried evidence and derailed investigations. Search teams that somehow never quite searched the right areas. The scope of it was almost incomprehensible, but I'd seen enough in my career to know it was entirely possible. Human monsters hiding in plain sight, using the very systems meant to protect children as tools to harm them. Elder watched me process this, his dark eyes holding something that looked like recognition. He understood that I finally understood. The forest people had been watching this facility for years, had witnessed the atrocities committed there, had rescued what children they could when opportunities presented themselves. But they couldn't stop it. They were too few, too vulnerable to human weapons, too aware that revealing themselves would bring a different kind of destruction down on their own heads. So they did what they could. They saved the ones they could save. They protected the ones who escaped. They bore witness to human evil and made the choice, again and again, to preserve life in the only way available to them. I returned to the children that evening with a decision that had been forming in my mind since Michael first spoke. I couldn't take them back. Not yet. Not until I could guarantee their safety. And right now, I couldn't guarantee anything, except that reporting this through official channels would get them killed and probably destroy the forest people in the process. The traffickers would move the operation, would clean up loose ends, would hunt down every child who could testify against them, and they had the resources to do it. So I made a promise to those 5 children, ages 7 to 13, who sat looking at me with eyes that held both hope and fear. I would find a way to stop the people who had taken them. I would find a way to make it safe for them to come home. But until then, they needed to stay here, in this hidden valley, protected by creatures who had shown more humanity than most humans ever would. I hiked out of that valley 3 days after entering it, my mind reeling with the weight of what I knew and the impossibility of what I had to do. I couldn't tell the FBI what I'd found. I couldn't tell Marcus or any of my colleagues. The corruption went too deep, the stakes were too high, and I had no way of knowing who could be trusted. I returned to the incident command center with a story I'd rehearsed during the long hike back, claiming I'd found no new evidence in the area Thomas had reported, just more of the same dead ends we'd been hitting for months. I watched Marcus's face fall with disappointment, watched the hope drain from the other investigators' eyes, and I hated myself for the lie. But I was protecting 5 living children, and that had to be worth any personal cost. I spent the next 2 months living a double life. By day, I continued my official duties with the investigation, following leads that I knew would go nowhere, attending briefings where we discussed theories that were completely wrong, watching resources get allocated to search areas I knew were deliberately chosen to miss the truth. By night, I began my own investigation, researching property records and shell companies, tracking financial transactions that connected to the area where Elder had shown me the facility, building a case slowly and carefully with evidence that would hold up even if I couldn't explain how I'd discovered it. I made 2 more trips back to the Hidden Valley, bringing supplies for the children, medical supplies and books and warm clothing that I carried in under the pretense of equipment testing in remote areas. The forest people allowed these visits, Elder greeting me each time with what I'd learned to recognize as acceptance, as trust. The children were adapting in ways that both broke my heart and gave me hope. They were learning the forest people's ways, learning to move quietly through the woods, learning to identify plants and read weather, learning the vocalizations that served as communication. The youngest, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie, had stopped speaking English entirely, preferring the clicking and rumbling sounds the creatures used. Michael, the oldest, appointed himself as translator and protector, his childhood stolen but his spirit somehow not entirely broken. He'd asked me during my second visit if I thought they were going crazy, living with Bigfoot, starting to think like them. I'd told him the truth. They were surviving, and survival required adaptation. What they were doing, bonding with their protectors, learning new ways of being in the world, it wasn't crazy. It was human resilience finding a path forward through impossible circumstances. But I also saw what the prolonged isolation was doing to them. They needed to go home. They needed therapy and education and the chance to be children again, to heal from trauma in an environment designed for healing. The valley was safety, but it wasn't home. It was a way station between horror and hope, and I needed to find a way to move them forward before the isolation itself became another kind of damage. So I worked my investigation with single-minded focus, building my case against the trafficking network, identifying players and operations and financial flows. I worked alone, trusting no one, knowing that one wrong move could destroy everything. The breakthrough came in late August, 4 months after I'd first followed Elder into his hidden valley. I'd traced a series of property transactions to a shell company owned by someone whose name made my blood freeze. Deputy Director James Torrance. He was 3 levels above me in the FBI hierarchy, a decorated agent with 30 years of service, someone I'd met personally at multiple briefings, someone who'd looked me in the eye and expressed sympathy for the families of missing children. And he was on the board of directors for the company that owned the land where the trafficking facility operated. The evidence wasn't conclusive yet, but it was enough to make me understand the scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just corruption. This was organization at the highest levels. I made a decision that went against every protocol I'd been trained to follow. I needed help, but it had to be from outside the system, from someone with power and resources who had no connection to the trafficking network. No way they could be compromised. I compiled everything I had, every piece of evidence, every document, every photograph I'd managed to take of the facility from distant vantage points that couldn't reveal how I'd found it. I created a package that told the story without mentioning Bigfoot, without revealing the valley, a narrative that suggested I'd developed a confidential informant in the trafficking network itself, someone deep inside who'd fed me information in exchange for protection. It was a lie built on truth, a necessary deception to protect both the children and their protectors. I sent that package to 3 people simultaneously. A journalist at the Washington Post who'd built a career on exposing trafficking networks and who had the protection of one of the country's major news organizations. A federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia who had a reputation for taking on corruption cases regardless of who it implicated. And a senator on the Intelligence Committee who'd been making noise about FBI oversight and accountability. I sent it encrypted, anonymously, with instructions that they needed to verify independently before acting, but that children's lives were at stake and time was critical. Then I waited, knowing I just put an enormous target on my back if the wrong people found out what I'd done. The response was faster than I'd anticipated. Within a week, the journalist had confirmed enough details independently to start making calls. Within 2 weeks, the prosecutor had opened a preliminary investigation. Within 3 weeks, federal agents not connected to my field office executed search warrants on the property where the facility was hidden. They found it. They found evidence of trafficking. They found DNA evidence from multiple children. They found documentation that implicated 17 people, including Deputy Director Torrance and 4 other high-ranking officials in various agencies. The news broke like a tsunami, dominating headlines,
triggering investigations across multiple states, and 5 children who had been recently taken and were still held at the facility when the raid occurred were recovered alive. But the 5 children in the Hidden Valley remained hidden because I made a choice that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I didn't tell anyone about them. I convinced myself it was to protect the forest people, to keep their existence secret, to prevent what would surely be a media circus and scientific exploitation if their species was confirmed. And that was part of it. But if I'm completely honest, it was also because I knew those 5 children were safer where they were than they would be in protective custody during a trial that would take years, where their testimony would paint targets on their backs, where even the best witness protection might not be enough against trafficking networks with resources and reach beyond what we'd uncovered. They'd been through enough. They deserved peace. And in that hidden valley, protected by beings who asked nothing in return for their compassion, they had a chance at something like peace. I visited them one final time before the media attention made it impossible for me to slip away unnoticed. I hiked into that valley, carrying supplies and carrying guilt and carrying the news that the immediate threat had been neutralized, that the facility was shut down, that the primary operators were in custody. The children gathered around me, their faces showing a mixture of joy and confusion and something like grief, because freedom meant leaving the only safety they'd known in months or years, meant saying goodbye to the creatures who'd protected them when humans had failed them. Michael, now 13 and looking far older than his years, asked me the question I'd known was coming. "Can we go home now?" I told them yes, but I also told them the truth.
Going home meant exposure, meant media attention, meant being the face of a tragedy that the whole world would want to examine. It meant testimony and trials and years of legal proceedings. It meant never being anonymous again, never being just kids again. And it meant they could never speak about the forest people, never reveal how they'd actually survived, because that truth would bring its own kind of destruction. They would have to lie about their time missing. They would have to say they'd hidden in the wilderness alone, had survived through luck and instinct, had avoided their captors through cunning. The real heroes of their survival story would have to remain secret, unacknowledged, protected by silence. The children made their choice. Sophie, the youngest, chose to stay. She couldn't articulate it fully, but she'd bonded too deeply with the forest people, had become too integrated into their group. The thought of leaving them, of going back to a human world that had allowed her to be taken in the first place, was more terrifying than staying in the valley. Her parents were dead, killed in the car accident that had left her vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. She had no immediate family desperate for her return, and the forest people had offered her something precious, belonging. Michael and the 3 other children, they chose to return. They wanted to see their families again, wanted to reclaim some version of their stolen lives. But they promised, with a solemnity that broke my heart, that they would never reveal the truth about their protectors. I led those 4 children out of the valley on a bright September morning, leaving Sophie behind with tears streaming down her face and a female forest person holding her hand gently. Elder walked with us to the boundary of their territory, his massive form moving silently through the forest one last time. At the point where we had to part ways, where I would lead the children the rest of the way to a ranger station where I'd arranged for their discovery, Elder did something I'll never forget. He knelt down in front of each child, placing one enormous hand on each of their heads in turn, a gesture that looked like blessing or farewell or both. When he came to Michael, the last in line, the boy threw his arms around the creature's neck, sobbing, thanking him in a mixture of English and the clicking vocalizations he'd learned. Elder held him for a moment, making soft sounds that needed no translation. They were the sounds of a parent saying goodbye to a child, the sounds of love that transcends species. The media coverage of the children's recovery was everything I'd feared. They were questioned endlessly, their story picked apart by investigators and journalists and therapists, all trying to understand how 4 children had survived months or years in the wilderness without more severe effects. Michael and the others stuck to the story we'd crafted. They'd escaped together, had hidden in caves and foraged for food, had evaded their captors through constant movement and the kind of luck that seemed almost miraculous. Some investigators were skeptical, noting details that didn't quite add up.
medical evaluations that showed the children were too well-nourished, too lacking in the expected parasites and infections from prolonged wilderness exposure. But there was no alternative explanation that fit the evidence they could see, and eventually, the investigation accepted their account. The families just wanted their children back. Nobody wanted to push too hard and risk re-traumatizing kids who'd already been through hell. I was celebrated as the investigator who'd broken the case, though I'd done it through unauthorized channels and methods that should have gotten me fired. Instead, I was promoted, given commendations, asked to speak at conferences about complex trafficking investigations, and I said yes to all of it, because visibility gave me protection. The more high-profile I became, the harder it would be for anyone connected to the network we'd exposed to come after me quietly. But success felt like ash in my mouth, because I knew the truth. The real heroes of this case were beings that science said didn't exist, creatures who'd shown more compassion and courage than most humans ever would, and they would never be acknowledged. Their heroism would remain forever secret, protected by lies necessary for their survival. I've made 4 more trips to the valley over the 2 years since. The forest people still allow me to visit, though I sense their wariness has deepened. The media attention, even though it hasn't touched them directly, has brought more people to the surrounding areas, more hikers and journalists and curiosity seekers. The wilderness that protected them through obscurity is slowly shrinking. They've talked about moving deeper, finding a new sanctuary even more remote, somewhere the human world can't find them. Elder is aging. I can see it in the gray creeping into his hair, the slightly slower pace of his movements. But his eyes still hold that deep intelligence, that patient wisdom that has guided his people through generations of hiding. Sophie is still with them. She's 9 now, and she barely remembers how to speak English. She communicates fluently in the forest people's language, moves through the woods with their grace, knows the plants and animals and rhythms of wilderness life better than most adult humans ever could. Part of me knows I should feel guilty about leaving her there, about not forcing her return to human civilization, but when I see her laughing, playing with the forest people's young, sleeping peacefully in the shelter of beings who cherish her, I can't convince myself I made the wrong choice. She's alive, she's safe, she's loved. That's more than the human world was offering her. Michael contacts me sometimes, emails sent through encrypted channels we set up. He's 15 now, living with his reunited family, seeing therapists 3 times a week, doing remarkably well considering everything he endured. But his messages reveal the weight he carries, the knowledge of what's still out there, the understanding that the trafficking network we exposed was just one branch of something much larger, and most of all, the burden of keeping the secret about his true saviors. He asks about Sophie in every message. He asks about Elder and the others. He asks if they're safe. I tell him yes, even though I'm less certain with each passing year. The human world is encroaching. Climate change is altering their habitat. The wilderness is shrinking. How much longer can they remain hidden? I've documented everything, of course. That's what scientists do. I have DNA samples that Elder allowed me to take, hair and saliva that genetically confirm what I observed. A species of human, a parallel branch that diverged from our line roughly 60 to 80,000 years ago, that adapted to deep forest life while we adapted to savanna and eventually global dominance. I have recordings of their vocalizations, hours of audio that analysis confirms contains linguistic structure, grammar, syntax, genuine language. I have photographs and videos and detailed field notes that would revolutionize our understanding of human evolution and cognition and the nature of consciousness itself. And I keep it all locked away in encrypted drives and safe deposit boxes. Material for my eventual confession. Evidence for the day when I'm too old to protect the secret anymore and need to pass the burden to someone else. Because that's what this is, a burden. The weight of knowing that an entire species exists in hiding, that they've been protecting human children from human monsters, and that revealing their existence would probably doom them. The scientific community would want to study them. The government would want to control them. The media would want to expose them. And in all that attention, the forest people's way of life,
Their culture, their freedom, their very survival would be threatened. They've watched us long enough to know what happens to species we find interesting. They've seen animals tagged and tracked and habituated until they're no longer truly wild. They've witnessed conservation that's really just another form of control. They know that human help often comes with strings that strangle. So I stay silent about the most important discovery of my career. I protect the beings who protected children when I couldn't. And I live with the knowledge that somewhere in the Cascade Mountains, in a hidden valley that shifts location every few years, a family group of forest people continues their ancient existence, guardians of wilderness and innocence, witnesses to human cruelty and human goodness, a species that chose compassion over indifference even when it put them at risk. They saved children that the human world had abandoned. They offered protection when our systems failed. They showed me that intelligence and emotion and morality aren't uniquely human traits, that they're broader capacities that we share with others if only we're humble enough to recognize them. The trafficking network continues to operate in diminished form. We caught many, but not all. The arrests and exposure disrupted their operations, but didn't destroy them completely. New cases emerge. Children still go missing. And sometimes, in the deep wilderness areas near where I know the forest people range, some of those children are found alive against all odds, telling stories of hiding in caves, of finding food and water through unlikely luck, of surviving through determination and chance. The official reports accept these explanations, but I know better. I recognize the pattern. The forest people are still watching, still protecting, still saving the ones they can save. I'm 49 now. In another 20 years, 30 if I'm lucky, I'll be too old to make the hikes into their territory. My knees already complain on the steep sections. The altitude bothers me more than it used to. Time is running out on my ability to maintain this connection, to serve as the bridge between their world and mine. I've started thinking about succession, about who I could trust with this secret when I can no longer carry it alone. It would have to be someone with scientific training to understand the significance, someone with compassion to prioritize the forest people's well-being over academic glory, someone with courage to bear the weight of knowledge that can't be shared. I haven't found that person yet. Maybe I won't. Maybe this secret dies with me, and the forest people return fully to myth and legend, protected by disbelief. But I hope not, because the world needs to know, eventually, that we're not alone in having consciousness and culture and moral capacity, that we share this planet with others who choose kindness over cruelty, who protect the vulnerable, who live by principles that many humans only pretend to value. The forest people are proof that intelligence and compassion aren't uniquely human achievements. They're broader patterns in nature, possibilities that evolution explores through different paths. And if humans could accept that, could truly understand that we're not the only ones who think and feel and choose, maybe we'd make different decisions about how we treat this world and everything in it. I made my last visit to the valley 3 months ago. Elder is slowing down significantly now. He moves with care, his strength diminishing, but his mind still sharp. We sat together by the stream where I'd first seen him years ago, and I tried to explain through gestures and the few vocalizations I'd learned that I wouldn't be able to visit much longer, that age was limiting my ability to make these journeys. He understood. He placed his hand on my shoulder in that gesture I'd come to recognize as affection or respect, and he made a sound that seemed to carry both sadness and acceptance. Change comes. Time passes. Even bonds between species have their seasons. Sophie joined us at the stream. She's a beautiful child, wild in the best sense of the word, free in ways that human children rarely are. She doesn't remember me as the person who chose to leave her here. She knows me as a friend of the family, someone who brings gifts and news from outside, but who belongs to a different world. She showed me the plants she'd learned to use for medicine, demonstrated her climbing skills on a cedar that would terrify most adults to ascend, sang me a song in the forest people's language that I couldn't understand, but that sounded beautiful nonetheless. And I thought about her human family,
Parents who grieved for her, who still search in their way, who light candles on her birthday and speak her name to an emptiness that will never be filled. I carry their pain like stones in my chest. But I also see her joy, her thriving, her place in a community that chose her. The ethics are impossible to untangle. As I prepared to leave that day, Elder gave me something. A carefully wrapped bundle of woven plant fiber containing a single object, a tooth, one of his own that had fallen out with age. In their culture, I'd learned, such a gift carried profound meaning, a piece of oneself freely given to another, a token of ultimate trust. I accepted it with both hands, understanding the honor, understanding that he was entrusting me with proof of his existence, evidence that could confirm everything if I chose to use it, but also trusting that I wouldn't, that I'd keep his secret as carefully as I'd kept it for years, that I'd carry this small piece of him as a reminder of what matters more than scientific fame or historical recognition, the promises we make to those who depend on us. I carry that tooth with me always now in a leather pouch on a cord around my neck. It's my reminder and my burden and my hope. Reminder of what I discovered, burden of what I can't reveal. Hope that someday, when the time is right and the world is ready, this evidence can serve not to exploit, but to protect, not to expose, but to honor, not to prove my claims, but to make people understand what we share this earth with. The missing children case officially closed 2 years ago with convictions that brought down a trafficking network spanning 3 states. 17 people are serving life sentences. The facility in the forest was demolished, the land seized and designated as protected wilderness. 5 children came home. The families celebrated and grieved and tried to rebuild lives shattered by trauma. And 1 child remained in the forest, thriving in ways that no report will ever document, protected by beings whose compassion defied every assumption about what it means to be human. I think about Michael's question often. Are the monsters the ones in the woods, or are they us? The answer, I've learned, is complicated and terrible and beautiful. The real monsters are the humans who exploit innocence. But the real heroes might be the ones hiding in the wilderness, the ones we've convinced ourselves don't exist, the ones who showed us what protection and sacrifice look like when they're genuine and unconditional. The forest people saved children that our systems abandoned. They offered sanctuary when our society offered only danger. They chose to act when action put them at risk. And they did it all in silence, expecting no recognition, asking no reward, accepting no praise. They did it because they could, because they witnessed suffering and chose not to look away. Because compassion is a capacity that transcends species and culture, and every boundary we imagine separates us from them. That's the revelation Bigfoot showed me. Not just where the missing children are, but what we could be if we chose mercy over indifference, protection over exploitation, silence over self-promotion. They showed me a different way of being in the world, and that knowledge has changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I don't know how much longer they can remain hidden. The world is shrinking. Technology is advancing. Satellites see everything now, mapping every square foot of wilderness, leaving fewer and fewer places that humans haven't documented and claimed. Climate change is altering the forests they depend on, forcing migrations into territory already crowded with human activity. How much time do they have before the accidental exposure, the trail camera that catches something it shouldn't, the drone that flies over the wrong valley, the curious hiker who stumbles into their sanctuary and doesn't make the choice I made to protect their secret? When that day comes, when their existence is finally confirmed beyond denial, I hope I'm still alive to speak for them. To use whatever authority my career has given me to argue for their protection, their autonomy, their right to exist without becoming specimens or curiosities or tourist attractions. To share what I've learned about their intelligence and compassion and culture, not as proof that they're almost human, but as proof that being human isn't the pinnacle of worth or moral consideration. To fight for their freedom in a world that rarely grants freedom to anything it finds interesting. But until that day comes, I keep the secret. I protect the protectors. I carry the weight of knowledge that could change the world, but that I choose to hold private, because revelation would mean destruction for beings who deserve only peace. I visit the families of missing children and feel the knife twist of guilt, knowing I could tell them their child is alive, is safe, is living wild and free in the mountains. But that truth would endanger both the child and her protectors, would bring a tension that would shatter the fragile sanctuary they've built together. So I stay silent, and the forest people continue their ancient watch, moving through wilderness like ghosts, protecting the boundaries between their world and ours, occasionally crossing that boundary to save a child when our systems fail them. Somewhere in the mountains right now, a family group is settling in for the night, checking on the young ones, sharing food and warmth, telling stories in a language older than our civilization. And among them might be a human child, one who slipped through the cracks of protective services, who was taken by monsters and saved by myths, who now sleeps safe in the arms of beings that science insists don't exist. That's the truth I carry. That's the revelation that haunts me. Bigfoot is real. They're compassionate. They're protecting our most vulnerable when we fail to. And the world isn't ready to know, because knowing would destroy them as surely as bullets or cages or the terrible bright light of human attention. So I keep their secret. I honor their trust. And I wait for a day when maybe, just maybe, humanity will be evolved enough to encounter another intelligent species with humility instead of dominance, with respect instead of exploitation, with gratitude instead of claim of ownership. Until then, they remain hidden. The guardians in the wilderness, the protectors of innocence, the beings who showed me that the real monsters in the woods aren't the ones covered in hair and standing 8 feet tall. The real monsters are the ones who look like us, speak like us, operate in our society, and prey on the vulnerable while we look away. The forest people don't look away. They act, they save, they love, and they ask nothing in return but the one thing I can give them: silence. So I stay silent. For them, for Sophie, for Elder, for all the children they might save in the future if their secret holds. I carry the tooth around my neck and the weight in my heart, and the knowledge that some truths are too dangerous to speak until the world is ready to hear them with wisdom instead of wonder, with protection instead of pursuit, with honor instead of exploitation. Bigfoot showed me where the missing children are. Some are in hidden valleys, protected by compassion that transcends species. Some are in the embrace of beings who chose their safety over their own invisibility. And some truths, the most important truths, remain unspoken because speaking them would destroy the very miracles they describe. That's the revelation. That's the burden. And that's the secret I'll carry until my dying day, or until the world becomes wise enough to receive it, whichever comes first.